The FBI and cybersecurity experts say China is attempting to hack U.S. firms conducting coronavirus research. In a statement on Wednesday, the FBI said China has, quote, been observed attempting to identify and illicitly obtain valuable intellectual property and public health data related to vaccines, treatments, and testing. The Bureau is encouraging research firms to beef up cybersecurity to protect their data. The Communist Chinese government is denying the claims, accusing the U.S. of a smear campaign. As the COVID virus continues to disrupt world markets, President Trump this week expressed disinterest in renegotiating Phase 1 of the trade deal with China. This after Chinese news media reported that the Communist government was dissatisfied with the current form of that agreement. What kind of game is Beijing playing? Here with analysis of the coronavirus effect on U.S.-China relations, global business, and much more is Asian affairs expert Chang. Gordon, thanks for being with us. I want to start with the U.S. trade deal with China. The coronavirus and China's handling of it are jeopardizing China's commitment to purchase $200 billion in U.S. exports by the end of next year. Sharp rhetoric from both sides we've heard all week, and it seems things have cooled as far as relations are concerned between the two. On Monday, President Trump reacted to a possible renegotiation of that trade deal with China this way.
No, I'm not interested. We signed a deal. I had heard that too. They'd like to reopen the trade talk to make it a better deal for them. China's been taking advantage of the United States for many, many years, for decades, because we had people at this position right here where I'm standing, sitting right in that office, the Oval Office, that allowed that to happen. No, I'm not interested in that. Let's see if they live up to the deal that they signed.
Is that the right approach for the president to take, Chang?
Absolutely the right approach, Raymond. And the reason is that Beijing knew about the coronavirus epidemic when they signed this deal. There's been a lot of people in state media who've been saying, oh, you know, this coronavirus epidemic is an unforeseen event. That unforeseen event refers to language in the Phase 1 trade deal, which would relieve a party of obligations. But when the Chinese actually signed this, they knew the severity of the outbreak in their own country. I don't think that they're entitled to any relief at all.
Will pulling back on trade force China, do you think, to be more transparent in its handling of COVID-19 and sharing information regarding its spread, or will it have no effect?
I think it will have no effect. Beijing is obviously hiding something. It has worked very hard to prevent an investigation into the origins of the disease. And I think that there's something there that they very much don't want us to know. So I don't think that anything regarding the trade deal will have an effect on the investigation.
How much leverage does the U.S. have to force China to make good on its commitments? For instance, the buying of all of those U.S. exports. Is there any way to measure or enforce the compliance?
Well, the one thing the United States can do is increase the tariffs under Section 301 of the Trade Act, which were a remedy for the theft of intellectual property. Those have been reduced according to the Phase 1, in pursuant to the Phase 1 trade deal. China needs the U.S. market desperately. And so if President Trump were to cut off access, that would have a substantial effect on the Chinese economy, driving it deeper into contraction.
Gordon, earlier this week, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was described by Chinese media as insane after he claimed that there was enormous evidence showing that COVID-19 came from a Wuhan laboratory, though he clarified it did not appear to be man-made or genetically modified, but the media characterized him as a conspiracy theorist. Is there sufficient evidence proving that he might be right, that it came from a lab?
Well, there's certainly evidence, circumstantial evidence, and also there's science. So, for instance, The Lancet, which is the authoritative British medical journal, on January 24th, and again in the middle of February, showed that about a third of the original coronavirus cases had no connection with the wet market, which is the dominant theory of where this started. So if it didn't start in the wet market, then the obvious other candidate would be a Wuhan lab. that China has been maintaining. So right now, I think that there's substantial evidence for that. Also, we know that China didn't adhere to safety protocols and procedures in that lab. That comes from a
Right.
2018 State Department investigative visit. So there's a lot of evidence that points in that direction, Raymond.
You've said this week that the Secretary's remarks, Secretary Pompeo's remarks, hit a nerve in Beijing. Can China continue to deny the evidence as it emerges?
Well, China has continued to deny the evidence, so I think they can go along with this in the indefinite future. But countries are going to make China pay a cost for it. And that cost could be quite severe. So, for instance, President Trump could cut off access to the Chinese market, something he talked about in that interview with Maria Bartiromo. So I think that China is probably going to be pretty concerned. But right now, if the party thinks that this is an existential issue about the origins of the coronavirus, it probably won't relent, despite what pressure we apply.
What does it tell you, Gordon, in that we now have the report that China may be attempting to pierce the cybersecurity of these research labs in the United States? Does that reveal to you that perhaps they don't have their hands around treatment or a vaccine, and that they're not as advanced as some in the U.S. media have given them credit for?
You know, that is a theory, and I think that it's a good one. We don't really know how far the Chinese are. I mean, they obviously had a head start because the disease originated in China. But the other thing is, we've got to remember that China will steal regardless. They've steal hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. IP a year. Medicines are a part of Xi Jinping's, the Chinese ruler's, Made in China 2025 initiative to dominate that sector by the year 2025. Also, you know, we know that the race to a vaccine is like our decade's space race. So race to the moon. So, yeah, they're going to steal it regardless.
Nancy Pelosi addressed the administration's focus on China and their lack of transparency regarding COVID, saying the president is using it. Listen to this.
Well, right now, I think that the focus that they're placing on China is a diversion from doing what we have to do in our country. Yes, we want to know the source of this pandemic, but let's focus on why we are not testing, how we can help people, and how our states and localities are losing resources and perhaps jobs, unless we address their concerns.
Is it a distraction, Gordon, to focus on China? Why is it crucial to trace the virus to its source and to get answers on that front?
Yeah, I think the speaker is wrong on that. And the reason is our response, our willingness to cooperate with China depends on what China did. If this were an accidental release from a lab and it just sort of snuck out of China, well, that means that we can cooperate with Beijing. But if, as the evidence suggests, that China actually maliciously spread this virus beyond its borders, that it intentionally wanted to infect the rest of the world, and there's a lot of evidence that points in that direction, Raymond, then obviously we can't cooperate with China, and that will inform our response. So we need to know what Beijing actually did before we can even think about working with other countries, including China.
Human rights continues to be a problem in communist China. We've discussed this so many times in the past, Gordon. The U.S. government agency responsible for investing federal pension dollars is suspending investment in some Chinese companies for China's stonewalling on COVID and due to the human rights record there. Does this have any effect? Will it have any effect on Beijing? Or is this just like the trade pressure? It's a wash.
Well, this is really important for us to do, coronavirus or no coronavirus. I mean, the Commerce Department maintains an entity list, which means Americans can't do business with certain Chinese companies without getting prior approval. But we can invest in those companies. We can own them. We can enrich them with investment dollars. That makes no sense whatsoever. So it was important for the president to direct the Thrift Savings Board to actually not invest in these Chinese companies. We should not be enriching a country with our dollars that intends to harm us. And China, I believe, did so by allowing this disease, actually pushing this disease beyond its borders.
Gordon, you know we have this divide. You have the Wall Streeters and the investment class who say, wait a minute, this is the largest market in the world. We've got to use this market. We've got to be a part of this market. There are others who say, hold on, we now have a malicious actor in the world who may have released a virus to kill our people. They destroy and kill and maim and monitor and suppress the freedoms of their own people. Back in the old Cold War days, we basically did not do business with the Russians. Why do we continue to do business with China today? And should that stop in the wake of all we know now and the personal toll on American lives?
Well, it certainly should stop. The reason why we do it is because we felt after the end of the Cold War that we could integrate China into the international system, that they would become a responsible stakeholder. That has proven not to be the case. As China's grown richer and stronger, it's become more belligerent and provocative. And, China right now is pushing this idea that it's the world's only sovereign state, which means that the United States is a vassal to China. I mean, that's just something that we cannot accept. So this is not competition with one country and another in the international system.
Right.
This is one country, China, trying to be a revolutionary, to force everyone to acknowledge Chinese rule. That's just something that we're not going to do.
The hegemon, preeminence in the world. Yeah, that's clearly the goal here. Now, China's influence goes beyond its borders. They mobilize their countrymen overseas, Gordon, to act as agents, if you will, in other countries. How powerful is their disinformation network abroad? And do you see it increasing now that they're under such scrutiny?
Well, China has maintained the largest and most effective disinformation network. And we saw it in the early stages of the pandemic, where China's messages were actually resonating in many places, including allies of the U.S. Now, as people start to look at what China did, they are much less effective. And so I don't think China will be able to put its messages across, at least with the same effectiveness. And that's a good thing, because obviously China is not telling the truth on very critical elements of the story.
The U.S. news media all over the world have seemed to cover for China, even praising them for handling the outbreak despite the communist government's arrest of scientists and journalists. Why are news outlets in the U.S. and abroad blindly trusting what the Chinese government spoon feeds them with, even praising them for control of their citizenry and saying this is a model for the rest of the world?
Yeah, this is a big mystery because we're seeing a number of elements in our society push China's line. I can only guess what their motives are, but you get a sense that whatever Trump wants to do, people are anti-Trump. And I think that's part of it. And so that's why they've adopted Communist Party narratives. This is irresponsible in the extreme. And I don't care whether you like the president or not. We have an obligation to defend ourselves against a common enemy, and that's China.
Right. Yeah. I want to ask you about the foreign nationals studying STEM at U.S. universities. How big a source of intelligence and intellectual property are they to the Chinese government? And should the number of foreign students from China be restricted, in your opinion?
Yeah, I think that we need to restrict foreign students, Chinese students, until we get our hands around this problem, because it is one of great magnitude. I mean, we have Chinese students downloading entire databases and sending them to China. So clearly that is unacceptable. This, I think, is one of the most difficult issues that we face, because there are so many conflicting interests here. But until we understand exactly what's going on, we're going to have to do something that's going to cost us dearly, and that is restricting the access of Chinese students to our databases.
Amazing. China has been conducting landing exercises, Gordon, seemingly aimed at taking over islands. Now, you tweeted about this earlier this week, saying that China's just announced to the world that it's going to invade Taiwan. Is the global pandemic a convenient cover for China's expansionist plans?
I think that it's a cover. Also, they see it a moment of opportunity, because the U.S. Navy is stricken with coronavirus in Asia. And so it sees the absence of American ships in its peripheral waters. Also, I don't know what's going on in the Chinese political system, but obviously there are incentives there to take the most belligerent positions. So that's also a factor. So you have a lot of things working in the wrong, all pointing in the wrong direction at the same time. And that's why we need to be extremely concerned, Raymond, with what Beijing is saying and doing.
Gordon, you're an outsider to this controversy within the Catholic Church. There is a lot of huge debate about whether that concord that the Vatican signed with Beijing strengthened the hand of Beijing and undermined the Catholic underground faithful there. Your thoughts on what impact that agreement might have had, one way or the other?
That agreement, I think, was certainly detrimental to the interests of the church and to China's Catholics. I don't know this, but I suspect that you have a number of Catholics now praying in Protestant unofficial congregations because Beijing has been able to use that agreement to undermine the church. And that they did it from the very beginning, violating the agreement. I think the Pope should never have entertained this.
Gordon Chang, we will leave it there. Thank you for being with us. We will check in the days ahead. And you can follow Gordon's work on Twitter at Gordon G. Chang. Don't miss it. He's got great insights into China, North Korea, and much more. Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you, Raymond.